The inflation stopped on November 15th, 1923. 1 trillion old marks. For one new Rentenmark. 1 trillion. The Germans who had held property, or gold, or anything real, they had survived the collapse. They knew it. They had done the right thing. What the forensic record shows is what the state did next. Who actually held on to their wealth by 1929, and who discovered that surviving the hyperinflation was only the first war. November 15th, 1923, East Prussia. A woman named Frau Barton is standing at a market stall. She has 1 Rentenmark in her hand. She buys a small tin bread bin. This purchase, this ordinary, unremarkable purchase of a bread bin, is documented. It appears in Constantino Bresciani-Turroni's 1937 economic analysis of the German inflation, and it is cited in the PBS documentary series on the commanding heights of the global economy. It matters because of what it meant. For years, Frau Barton could not do this, could not walk to a stall, see a price, and trust that the price would be the same by the time she reached the counter. Inflation had destroyed the mechanism by which ordinary life runs. You cannot plan, cannot save, cannot buy for tomorrow when the numbers change by the hour. And now, on November 15th, 1923, the numbers had stopped changing. The Rentenbank had been established by decree on October 15th, capitalized at 3.2 billion Rentenmarks, backed by a legal mortgage on all German land and all German industry. Was it real? Was the Rentenmark actually backed by something you could touch? The economists who studied it knew the truth. Bresciani-Turroni called it, plainly, a legal fiction. The assets could not actually be liquidated. Germany could not foreclose on its own industry to pay its own bills. But the fiction worked, because Frau Barton wanted to believe it, because every German who had been carrying wheelbarrows wanted to believe it. And in 1923, belief was enough. The inflation had stopped. And for the Germans who had done everything right, who had bought property or held gold or paid off mortgages in worthless paper marks, it felt like the end of the story. It was not. Here is what most accounts of the Weimar hyperinflation leave out. The common assumption is this: the people who held hard assets, land, gold, anything that paper money could not erase, survived. They converted their mortgages into nothing with cheap inflated marks. They held property while paper savings went to zero, and when the Rentenmark came, they were positioned to benefit from the recovery. The forensic record shows a more complicated picture. What followed November 15, 1923, was not a smooth recovery. It was, as Gerald Feldman documents in his definitive 1,000-page study of the German inflation, a stabilization crisis, a period in which the cure for hyperinflation produced its own category of damage. Start with the numbers. In August of 1923, at the height of the collapse, 1,339,000 Germans were receiving public unemployment assistance. By January of 1924, 6 weeks after stabilization, that figure had reached 1,533,000. The inflation had ended. The unemployment had spiked. The discount rate at the Reichsbank had reached 90% per annum. Credit had effectively stopped. Why? Because Hjalmar Schacht, appointed currency commissioner on November 12, 1923, then Reichsbank president by the end of December, had made a deliberate decision. He would not allow the Reichsbank to discount new government treasury bills. He would not allow cheap credit to flow. He would, in his own account published in 1927, bolt the door against any return to deficit financing. The door was bolted, and everything that needed cheap credit to survive walked into it. The forensic record identifies 3 distinct mechanisms through which the German state, between 1923 and 1925, systematically reduced the wealth that hard asset holders thought they had secured. They were not designed together. They were not a conspiracy. But their combined effect, documented across Feldman, Bresciani-Turroni, and the legal archive, was what the period's victims called a second war on wealth. Gold. Gold had been the obvious refuge during the inflation. If paper marks were worthless, something that could not be printed had value. And in 1923, that logic was correct. But the shocked credit squeeze of early 1924 created a new problem. With the discount rate at 90% per annum, with credit unavailable, with businesses collapsing and tax bills arriving in hard Reichsmarks, many holders of gold and foreign currency found themselves needing to sell those assets at a disadvantage to meet immediate obligations. The Reichsbank also implemented controls on foreign exchange that restricted the freedom of hard currency holders from 1924 forward. The shocked squeeze did not destroy gold, but it forced distress selling at the worst possible moment, before the stabilization had produced enough economic activity to establish fair prices. In spring of 1924, the German government introduced the Hauszinssteuer, the house interest tax. Here is what it was. During the hyperinflation, German property owners had paid off their mortgages in worthless paper marks. A mortgage that had represented a serious debt in 1914 became payable in marks worth fractions of a pfennig. The property owners had effectively received free real estate. The state called this saved interest, the interest payments that the inflation had erased. The Hauszinssteuer taxed that saved interest. Feldman documents the rates as extraordinary, structured to extract a substantial portion of rental income from property owners, creating effective tax burdens that small landlords had never faced in the pre-war era. And simultaneously, rent controls from the wartime period remained in place. Property owners could not raise rents to cover the new tax. Their income was capped. Their obligations were not. The revenue was substantial, approximately 750 million Reichsmarks per year, channeled partly into housing construction. The property that had survived the inflation had become a liability. On July 16, 1925, the German Reichstag passed the Aufwertungsgesetz, the Revaluation Act. This was the law that officially decided what survivors' assets were worth. Before this act, there had been a reasonable expectation among German creditors and bondholders that inflation-era losses would be made whole. The courts had been granting partial revaluations. 3.5 million cases had reached German courts by this point. 3.5 million. The Aufwertungsgesetz ended the negotiation. Mortgages, revalued at 25% of their original gold value. Government bonds, the Kriegsanleihen, the patriotic war bonds that an entire generation had purchased to support the state, revalued at 2.5% of face value. Payments deferred until after war reparations were settled, which meant, in practical terms, deferred indefinitely. 2.5% of war value or face value. 2.5% of their work value in self, and the cases that reports in with 40% of wither today. The long way outside of Lenk, with many of the reasons of the counts that you found. Performly this thing that you worked with way from German is actually not, but as well as known with a changes of well design and forgetting. But what of the things that look, had been proving the work for somewhere that you done, would been to differently in very 16 of the changes. 2.5% of what a generation had been told was a safe investment. The act also had one specific effect that property holders had not anticipated. It reinstated 25% of the original gold value of mortgages as a Reichsmark debt, due at hard money interest rates. The mortgage you had paid off in worthless paper? It was now, partially, back. Victor Klemperer was a professor of linguistics in Dresden. He kept a diary. On October 8, 1923, he recorded paying 104 million marks for a cinema ticket and a tram ride, and noted what he called a total loss of feeling for numbers. He survived the inflation. He held a university post. He had a salary. What Klemperer documented in the years that followed was something different, a permanent state of financial anxiety that the stabilization never resolved. He struggled to fund his older sister's education. He purchased a car he came close to regretting. It consumed, in his own words, his heart, his nerves, his time, and his money. He had not been ruined, but he had been permanently altered. The pre-war world in which professional status produced financial security had been dissolved, and no amount of Reichsmarks reconstructed it. This is what historians now call the pauperization of the professional class, a documented pattern in which those who survived the inflation were ground down not by the crisis itself, but by the decade of austerity and restructuring that followed. Klemperer's experience in the years between 1923 and 1929 is worth examining as history, a window into how people actually behaved when the systems they trusted stopped working, not as a prescription for any situation today. Then there was Maximilian Bern. Bern held 100,000 marks in savings before the inflation, a pre-war fortune. He waited for the government to fix the currency. He believed that a state as organized as Germany would not allow its citizens' savings to simply disappear. He withdrew his savings in late 1923, at the exact peak of the collapse. By the time the notes were in his hands, they were insufficient to purchase more than a few days of basic food. By 1924, Bern was in absolute poverty. He had nothing that the 1925 Revaluation Act could partially restore. The act helped those who had held mortgages and property. It helped no one who had held only paper. And then there was the empire of Hugo Stinnes. Stinnes had built his fortune through the hyperinflation by borrowing in worthless marks to acquire coal, steel, newspapers, and shipping lines. Thousands of companies, according to Feldman's research. He borrowed when money was cheap. He acquired when assets were available. He repaid in marks worth even less than when he had borrowed. The strategy was rational, and it worked, until November 15, 1923. The moment the Rentenmark introduced real scarcity back into the German monetary system, the interest rates on new borrowing reached levels that made the conglomerate's debt structure untenable. Stinnes died in April of 1924, before the full collapse. His heirs inherited the structure. By 1925, the conglomerate was in bankruptcy, assets sold off to creditors who now demanded payment in real value. The strategy that won during the inflation became fatal the moment money had real scarcity again. So, who actually kept their wealth by 1929? The forensic record from 8 documented cases shows a pattern that does not match the simple story. Stefan Zweig, author, cosmopolitan, member of the Viennese cultural upper class, was financially secure by 1928. What had he done differently? He had recognized early, Zweig's memoir documents this explicitly, that the currency's collapse was terminal, not temporary. He held assets with international value. He maintained professional relationships across borders. His work was marketable outside Germany and Austria. He was not simply holding gold. He was holding something no government decree could revalue, a career with international demand. And still, Zweig documented what he called a caesura, a permanent break in the continuity of civilized life. He wrote that even the financially successful felt homeless in the new culture. The people who had survived the inflation with their finances intact had nonetheless lost the world in which those finances had meaning. Financial survival, the forensic record shows, was not the same as recovery. Fritz Thyssen, the industrialist, took a different path. Following the stabilization, he used the inflow of foreign capital from the Dawes Plan to rationalize his steel plants technically, to convert from inflation-era leverage to productivity-era efficiency. In 1926, he formed the Vereinigte Stahlwerke, United Steelworks, with 200,000 employees. He survived not by holding assets through the transition, but by transforming how those assets produced value. Julius Curtius, who would serve as economics minister from 1926, navigated the period by occupying a role in the new system's architecture, not merely a position within it. The documented record from this period shows 4 patterns. Those who held only paper currency until the end lost everything. Those who held hard assets survived the inflation, but were immediately targeted by the state's stabilization apparatus through tax and revaluation. Those who used inflation-era leverage as a permanent strategy found that leverage became fatal the moment money had real scarcity. And those who held assets with value that transcended the German monetary system entirely, or who shaped the rules of the new system from within it, fared better than those who simply waited to be assigned a new price. These are patterns from 8 documented historical cases. They are not investment principles. They are what the record shows happened to specific people in Germany between 1923 and 1929. The founding decree of the Rentenbank, the single document that actually stopped the inflation, is linked in the Macro Noir archive this week. You can read Section 16 yourself, the clause that bolted the door against deficit financing. Link is in the description. By 1925, German national income had begun to rise. By 1927, industrial production had recovered to approximately its pre-war baseline. Real wages for industrial workers, which had fallen to roughly 50% of 1913 levels during the worst of the crisis, had recovered to 75% by 1925 and continued rising through the decade. The newspapers called it the Golden Twenties. Berlin became, briefly, the cultural capital of the world. Cabarets, architecture, film. A city consuming modernity as fast as it could be manufactured. But Albrecht Ritschl's research at the London School of Economics documents what the Golden Twenties were actually built on. 29 billion Reichsmarks in foreign loans, primarily American, flowed into Germany between 1924 and 1929. The Dawes Plan of April 1924 had restructured the reparations schedule and arranged an initial international loan of 800 million gold marks to re-establish German credit. Adam Ferguson's When Money Dies is where I found the fullest narrative account of this period, what the collapse felt like from inside, and what happened to the individuals who lived through it. I've left a link below. Gustav Stresemann, the foreign minister who had orchestrated Germany's diplomatic reintegration, negotiated the Dawes framework and signed the Locarno Pact, died on October 3, 1929. 3 weeks later, Wall Street collapsed. The American loans stopped. The banks that had extended credit to German municipalities, businesses, and industries began calling those loans. The German banking system, which had rebuilt itself on the assumption of continued American capital, had no self-sustaining base to fall back on. What had looked like recovery was revealed as a loan, and the loan had been recalled. The unemployment insurance law that had passed in 1927, covering 16.4 million workers, was about to face claims it had never been designed to handle. The Golden Twenties lasted 6 years. They required American confidence to remain intact. The forensic record from 1923 to 1929 contains a specific kind of lesson. Not about what to do. The record does not tell you that. Not about what is coming. The record cannot see forward. What it shows is this: the moment a financial crisis is resolved, the resolution itself creates a new set of rules, and those rules are written by the institution that survives the crisis, not by the individuals who held the right assets, not by those who saw it coming. In 1923, the German state was fiscally destroyed. By 1925, it was writing laws that decided what a survivor's savings were worth. The Aufwertungsgesetz said, your mortgage, 25%, your government bond, 2.5%, your patience, your loyalty to the system, valued accordingly. 3.5 million court cases followed. 3.5 million Germans who had believed that the law would protect the value of what they had entrusted to it. Most of them lost. Stefan Zweig, who survived financially, who by 1928 was secure, wrote something in the world of yesterday that economic historians tend not to linger on. He wrote that even the people who had saved their money had not saved their world. The old values, he wrote, had been devalued alongside the currency, and no Rentenmark at any exchange rate could bring them back. The inflation had been the crisis, The stabilization was the reckoning. You now have this evidence. What you do with it belongs to you. The question I keep returning to, looking to the introdu, which is part, the fundamented approach, the key power. The work was specifically fully up back in the future that you'd have employed that was around the crisis for this law. The question I keep returning to, looking to the breadcast, the different securities. The question I keep returning to, looking to the individual books in the monthful church of the Great Description. The question I keep returning to, looking to the individual books in the monthful currency at the records of next work. You now have this evidence. The inflation had been the crisis, was the reckoning. What you to keep returning to, looking at the documented cases from this period, is this. If you had been a German with a paid-off property in 1924, receiving the Hauszinssteuer bill and the Aufwertungsgesetz coming, would you have trusted that the state's new rules were the end of the adjustment or only the beginning of it?